Here is our introduction to organic molecules. We're going to look at why certain molecules are found in all living things. We want to consider the significance of this for a moment. We're going to be talking about how there are 4 categories of organic molecules. We'll go through what they are, what they look like, kind of what are they named by. And what we're looking at in this unit is we're looking at molecules that we find in every single living thing. So if you kind of imagine back from classification some of the interesting, crazy forms of life that we saw, now you have to remember at their most basic molecular form, these things are all made of the same molecules in slight variations, making them up. And that's a really cool and interesting thing. What we want to do is know a little bit more about what are these categories of organic molecules found in all living things and why are they so important? So what jobs are they doing in living things that are so essential that every living thing needs them? So we've got the first bullet here. Organic molecules are essential to life. The second thing we want to make sure we know going into this is that in this unit, we're talking about food. So when I start talking to you about organic macromolecules, examples, jobs that they're doing, what I'm talking about is what you eat, what you take into your body, and then your digestive system breaks down into its most basic forms, and then your cells repurpose. And so the jobs that they're doing with these molecules from your food. Now, I keep calling them organic molecules. We want to make sure we know what it means for a molecule to be organic. So here we go. If any molecule has carbons attached to one another, and it can be in a long chain like this fatty acid, highlighted, like this fatty acid chain that I have over here on the left. So we notice the core and the backbone that gives this molecule its structure is a long chain of carbons. Or like this benzene molecule over here, that nice ring shape that we see, what's giving it that shape? Again, it's carbons attached to one another. So these would both be visual examples of an organic molecule. Now, carbon is not the only the only atom that we find in living things, but it is one of the 6 most common elements found in all living things. So we have this nice acronym called CHOMPS, CHONPS, and that is a way that we can remember what are these 6 elements that we find in living things. Carbon makes our first list with letter C, but then we have hydrogen, which is abbreviated with elemental symbol H, oxygen for O, nitrogen for N, phosphorus for P, and sulfur for S. Now, another cool thing for us to keep in mind, so we're talking about how organic macromolecules make up all living things. We find them in anything that's alive. What's inside those organic macromolecules are these 6 elements. So again, this is just another thread that ties together all living things. All right, so why does carbon get to first billing, though, on our 6 elements found in common living things? Well, it's because carbon has some really unique properties that are essential to life. First and foremost, it's a really small molecule that can make between 1 and 4 covalent bonds. Covalent bonds, remember, are incredibly strong. So when carbon bonds to other atoms, like it does typically to nitrogen or oxygen or really commonly to hydrogen, it bonds very tightly. So these are strong connections. And this allows living things to build these massive molecules using carbon kind of as the frame to actually construct them out of. I told you guys kind of earlier, organic molecules, there are 4 categories found in all living things, super important. But remember, we're talking about our food here. So to give us a little bit of a reference of what our 4 categories are, introduce them, and then also see what does it mean when we're talking about food, we bring ourselves to this point. So the first category of organic molecules we're going to be talking about are carbohydrates. Now, carbohydrates are absolutely what you think of when you think of the plate from health class. So they're your breads, your grains, your cereals. So just like the bun of our hamburger bun. But carbs also include your sugars. So I'm pointing to a tomato here, but I could be pointing to the ketchup as well. So any sugary sweetness you get in there, that is also a carbohydrate. Lipids are your fats. So we're pointing to the cheese there, but again, I could be pointing to the burger as well because we see that nice sheen on there. That's some nice lipids, some nice fat that we have in our cheeseburger. Our third category of organic molecule are nucleic acids. Nucleic acids, Na. We might be hopefully thinking about DNA or deoxyribonucleic acid. So nucleic acids are the actual molecule that codes for instructions in all living things. So remember, the burger bun was once upon a time wheat, which had DNA. The lettuce, the tomato, the onion all had DNA, so they all had nucleic acids. So yeah, when we eat food, we're eating some amount and some particles of nucleic acids. And last but not least, your proteins. So you notice you've got a nice burger there. That is cow protein. And so proteins make up our fourth category of organic molecule. What we're going to do now is kind of start our overview of the four categories of organic molecules. This is an intro. We are looking at this so we can get kind of a long distance view of, okay, what's the information we're looking at in this unit? And then we can come back and dissect each of these topics in a much more in-depth in class together. So right now, broad overview, what's the information? What does the whole unit look like? And then more work in class together. So the first thing we start with are our four categories we just looked at: carbs, lipids, nucleic acids, and proteins. What we find is that there are certain elements we find in certain categories of organic molecules. So we want to make sure we've got this down in our notes. The first thing I want to point out to you guys, so we should notice that carbon, letter C, hydrogen, letter O, and hydrogen, letter H, and oxygen, letter O, are found in every single one of my organic molecules. So I look and I've got CHO in carbs, lipids, nucleic acids, and proteins. Now for carbs and lipids, those are the only elements they have. Nucleic acids have both nitrogen and phosphorus, and proteins have just nitrogen in addition to carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So we notice they're all a little different in terms of what elements actually make them up. Now we'll notice the other things we're going to look at in our preview. So we're going to look at what are the monomers and what are the polymers for these as well. Now, if we consider these words themselves, monomer, polymer, mono means one and poly means many. So what we're looking at here is we're going to actually be looking at how these molecules are made up. So the interesting thing about whether we're talking about carbs, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids, any of my categories of organic molecules, is they're these massive molecules, but they're all built essentially the same way. You have some smaller molecule, sort of like a building block, and you just put a bunch of those together in a chain or in some complex structure, and you make a polymer. You make a big, big molecule. But that polymer is just made up of a bunch of repeating monomers. So what we have for each of our categories of organic molecules is we have names for the building block, the monomer, and we have names for the polymer, the large molecule that we make when we put them all together. So if we look at our monomers, polymers, and then our monomer structure, we start with carbs. So the name for the building block for your carbs is a monosaccharide. Put a bunch of monosaccharides together, you get a polysaccharide, and your monosaccharides are going to be ring-shaped. So we notice we've got a nice easy picture of a hexagon there. If I were to put a bunch of hexagons together, I could build a polysaccharide. Now again, these are really easy to remember for carbs because mono means one, poly means many, and you notice it keeps the prefix of monomer and polymer. Saccharide itself just means sugar. Next one we have lipids. Feel free to pause at any time if you need more time to fill this in, by the way. Your lipids are an interesting category because it's actually just any molecule that doesn't mix with water we call a lipid. So the common structure we find is the fatty acid chain. And so if we look down here at the structure of our fatty acid chains, they're also called hydrocarbon chains, which sounds fancy, but if you break it down, hydro, hydrogen, carbon. And so what do we see? Well, if I look at my picture I've got down here in the structure, it's just a long line of carbons with hydrogens coming off them. Now, I give you a really short example of a fatty acid chain right here. There's only 4 carbons in this chain. Excuse me. But you could easily have a hydrocarbon chain that has 10, 20, 30 carbons in a row. So these can get really, really long. Now, while there is not one single polymer, there are a couple really common examples we talk about. So if you combine these fatty acid chains with other molecules, you can make things like triglycerides. So triglycerides are actually what's in your dietary fat, so in your cheeseburger, and also body fat. Phospholipids is another example of something we can make by combining fatty acids with other molecules. And these are what make up the cell membrane and also the nuclear membrane. Our next one in our preview of our organic molecules is our information on nucleic acids. So I already said nucleic acids are things like DNA and RNA, and they are built of molecules called nucleotides. And you put a bunch of nucleotides together, easiest one to remember, and you get a nucleic acid. Now, what a nucleotide actually looks like is there's 3 components, and this is a very simplified diagram, but it gives us kind of a nice visual of what would be inside of a nucleotide. You have a phosphate group called that because it has a phosphorus in it. I see a nice ring shape right here, and I remember, when I see a ring, I know I'm looking at a monosaccharide or a sugar, and so that's what we have right here. We have a sugar, And then last but not least, we have a base. So the base would actually be the letter part of our DNA code. So for example, the A's, T's, G's, C's in your genetic code is determined by those bases. Last but not least, proteins. Proteins are built out of molecules called amino acids. You string a bunch of amino acids together and you can build a molecule called a polypeptide. In terms of what an amino acid actually looks like, you might need to pause here and kind of fill this in. Amino acids are basically just a T with a carbon sitting right in the middle right here. Off the top, there's an H. Off the bottom, there's an R. Now, R in chemistry is like X in algebra. It means variable. It means different molecules or different structures can sit in this spot. And then coming off the other side of my T, I have an amino group, which is a nitrogen with 2 hydrogens. And then off the other end of my T, carboxyl group. So a C double bonded to an oxygen attached to another OH. And so this fourth row that we have down here just shows us what do those monomers look like. We notice carbs look very different than lipids, which look very different from nucleic acids. One of the things we want to be working towards is recognizing these structures and being able to describe differences between them. And we're going to look a lot more in depth about how these variable structures make them better at doing their jobs. So again, just a preview of this. We'll do more work in class together on these. If you have any questions, please feel free to email.